c4, English opening, opening line. The English opening move avoids a number of black defenses and proceeds on the more deliberate idea of counterattacking in the center, often in conjunction with fianchettoing both bishops. g6, English opening, great snake variation, opening line. Positions that evolve from this position tend to be closed in nature, with long-range strategical motives. Historically, white wins 8% more games, but the 1990-95 statistic is only 4+% better for white. Eventually, the defense always catches up. g3, out of opening book, e4, would have been in the English opening, great snake variation, opening line. Knight c6. Bishop g2. e6. Knight c3. h5. d4. d5 threatens white's pawn at c4. c takes d5, attacks black's knight at c6. e takes d5, removes the threat on black's knight at c6. Knight takes d5. White wins 2 pawns for a pawn. White is up a pawn in material. Bishop g7. Slightly better is knight c e7. Bishop f4. Rook b8 leads to bishop takes c7, queen d7, bishop takes b8, knight takes b8, rook c1, knight c6, e3, knight g e7, queen f3, king f8, knight e2, queen d6, which wins a bishop for a rook and a pawn. Better is king f8 leading to knight takes c7, rook b8, knight b5, rook a8, knight f3, queen a5, check, knight c3, bishop e6, castle kingside, rook d8, e3, knight f6, which loses a pawn. Bishop takes c7. Forks black's queen and black's rook at b8 and creates a passed pawn on d4. Queen d7 moves it to safety. Bishop takes b8. Knight takes b8. White wins a rook and a pawn for a bishop. Rook c1. Knight f6 leads to knight takes f6, check, bishop takes f6, bishop h3, queen b5, rook takes c8, check, king e7, queen d3, queen takes d3, e takes d3, rook takes c8, bishop takes c8, bishop takes d4, b3, b6, knight f3, bishop g7, which wins a queen, a rook, a knight, and a pawn for a queen, a rook, a bishop, and a knight. Better is knight c6 leading to queen a4, queen d8, e3, bishop d7, knight e2, knight g e7, queen b3, bishop e6, knight e c3, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, which wins a knight for a knight. This was black's key blunder. Black was never able to recover and eventually resigned. Knight takes f6, check, forks black's queen and black's king and blocks black's pawn at f7. Bishop takes f6. Removes the threat on black's king and black's queen. Black wins a knight for a knight. Bishop h3 skewers black's queen and attacks black's queen. Queen d5 moves it to safety, forks white's rook at h1 and white's pawn at a2, and blocks white's pawn at d4. Rook takes c8, check, removes the threat on white's pawn at a2 and white's rook at h1 and forks black's king and black's knight. White wins a bishop. White is up a rook and 2 pawns. King e7. Moves it out of check, removes the threat on black's knight and forks white's rook at h1 and white's pawn at a2. Rook c7, check, removes the threat on white's pawn at a2 and white's rook at h1 and checks black's king. King f8. Moves it out of check and forks white's rook at h1 and white's pawn at a2. Knight f3. Protects white's rook at h1 and makes way for a castle to the king side. Queen a5, check, forks white's rook at c7 and white's king. Rook c3. Moves it out of immediate danger and protects white's king. h4. G takes h4. Bishop takes h4. Slightly better is knight c6. Knight takes h4. Rook takes h4. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop and a pawn. Bishop g2 threatens black's pawn at b7. Knight d7. Castle kingside. Releases white's rook at c3 from the pin. Knight e5. Danger! Hangs the knight. Leads to d takes e5, king g7, queen d6, queen b6, queen takes b6, a takes b6, rook c7, rook b4, b3, rook f4, e6, rook f5, e takes f7, rook takes f7, rook takes f7, check, king takes f7, bishop takes b7, which wins a queen, a rook, and a pawn for a queen, a rook, a knight, and 2 pawns. Much better is queen takes a2, leading to e3, queen takes b2, rook c7, knight f6, queen b1, queen takes b1, rook takes b1, a5, rook b takes b7, rook h7, rook a7, which wins a queen and 2 pawns for a queen and a pawn. D takes e5, pushes the passed pawn. Queen takes e5. Yikes! Leads to queen d8. Check. King g7. Queen takes h4. Queen f6. Queen takes f6. Check. King takes f6. Bishop takes b7. g5. Rook c7. King e5. Rook takes f7. King e6. Rook c7. King e5. Rook e7. Check. King d6, which wins a queen and a pawn for a queen, a rook, and 2 pawns. Much better is king g7, leading to queen d6, queen b6, queen e7, rook h8, bishop d5, rook f8, rook f3, a5, rook d1, queen a6, rook takes f7, check, rook takes f7, queen takes f7, check, king h6, which wins a rook for a rook and a pawn. Queen d8, check, forks black's king and black's rook. Black resigns.